January 1944. Northern France. A thin layer of frost clings to the edges of a narrow farm track that runs between two abandoned stone outbuildings. The night air is still heavy and painfully cold. Far in the distance, the muted rumble of artillery rolls like distant thunder, but here, in this forgotten pocket behind the German line, only the crunch of a sentry's boots disturbs the silence. In the shadows beside a collapsed cattle shed, a lone Allied operative waits. His breath forms slow, controlled clouds that drift upward and vanish in the dark. He has been here for nearly an hour, motionless, counting each guard's rotation, memorizing the rhythm of their steps as precisely as the ticking of a metronome. Their patterns are predictable, rehearsed, and complacent. That complacency is the only advantage he has. Strapped to his boot is the small device he crafted against orders, a simple knife mounted at a fixed angle, connected to a taut black cord stretched low across the track. It is crude, effective. It was banned for being too indiscriminate, yet tonight, it is the only tool capable of clearing a path before dawn. And to understand how he reached this moment, we must step back into the world that shaped both the man and his forbidden invention. By early 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a phase defined by uncertainty, secrecy, and the quietly escalating tempo of Allied infiltration. Across France, the networks of the British Special Operations Executive, the American OSS, and various resistance groups were expanding, gathering intelligence for the coming invasion while striking at German supply lines, communication posts, and key transit routes. These efforts relied not on large formations or heavy weapons, but on individuals trained to operate alone or in pairs, moving through enemy-held terrain where a single misstep could expose their presence. German occupation units, particularly rear area security battalions and Feldgendarmerie detachments, patrolled roads, farm tracks, and rail corridors in predictable cycles. Their routines often reflected the belief that resistance fighters were scattered, poorly equipped, and dependent on surprise rather than sustained combat. It created an environment where a lone operative could exploit patterns, but only with tools adapted for close, silent action. A firearm risked a report heard hundreds of meters away. A captured weapon risked misidentification by friendly networks. Even a suppressed pistol, rare and tightly controlled, was often avoided because the crack of the bullet still carried along stone walls and narrow lanes. For Allied, trained infiltrators, the greatest threat was not the regular army, but the small groups of guards who controlled choke points, farm roads leading to signal stations, bridges, or buried cable junctions. Removing these guards silently was essential for bypassing them or for allowing a local resistance cell to move equipment through the area. Yet official doctrine discouraged improvised traps. Training schools emphasized knives, garrotes, and hand-to-hand methods that required proximity but allowed control. Anything automated or triggered remotely introduced variables: wind, animal interference, unintended targets, and the possibility of discovery. A failed device could alert a patrol, close the route, or lead to brutal reprisals against civilians. Still, under the pressure of field conditions, operatives sometimes developed personal tools. Some fashioned slotted brass knuckles from scrap metal, others modified hatpins, wire saws, or folding knives to suit specific missions. Most inventions were tolerated so long as they caused no risk to friendly populations. But certain contraptions, especially those relying on tripwires, were formally banned during training. They were deemed indiscriminate, difficult to conceal permanently, and too easily triggered by livestock or local residents. A knife fixed at ankle height and activated by a tight cord across a patrol route fell into that category. The man who carried such a device into northern France had not designed it out of recklessness. He had seen, during winter exercises in Scotland, how German sentries often failed to look down in low light, focusing instead on the horizon or their overlapping sectors. He understood that a tripline, barely visible against frozen earth, forced a predictable motion: a step forward, sudden imbalance, and a forward fall. In knife combat, direction and momentum were everything. But at the training school, instructors rejected the idea outright, warning that the risk of harming an unintended target outweighed any tactical advantage. Months later, deployed behind German lines, he found himself operating alone after a courier route was compromised. His orders required reaching a farmstead where underground cables linked German observation posts to a regional headquarters. The road to it was guarded by rotating pairs of sentries on a single narrow track. Passing them without a firearm, without support, and without noise demanded a solution the standard kit did not provide. That decision, the quiet acceptance that doctrine and reality were now in conflict, set the stage for the moment in which his forbidden creation would finally be tested, and its consequences would unfold through several intertwined perspectives. He had learned early in his training that silence was a discipline, not an instinct. The instructors at Arisaig and Beaulieu drilled it into every volunteer: breath must be controlled, footsteps must be measured, and every movement must have purpose. But silence in the field was something else entirely. It was the pressure of being alone, beyond rescue, carrying orders that depended on a single person's judgment. The human cost of that pressure shaped him long before he crafted any device. He had watched resistance fighters risk their families' lives to pass messages. He had folded the torn, rain-soaked note of a courier who never reached the drop point. Those losses changed him. They sharpened his sense of responsibility. To him, the banned Tripline knife was not an act of brutality, but an adaptation born from the obligation to protect people who had placed everything on the line. The moral weight of survival was constant, and in that weight he recognized that improvisation was not cleverness, it was necessity. That necessity became tactical clarity as he studied the guard rotations on the narrow French track. German rear area sentries were often experienced soldiers recovering from injuries or men rotated from the Eastern Front, where exhaustion dulled attentiveness. Their patrol path cut directly between two stone structures, creating a natural funnel. Any approach, even in darkness, carried the risk of detection. The simplest tactic, waiting for a rotation gap, was impossible. The intervals were too short. A silent neutralization required exploiting the terrain, not overpowering it. A low tripline, placed in the track's shadowed center, where lantern light never reached, forced the enemy into predictable motion. The fall direction, angle, and timing could be controlled. A weapon that used the guard's own momentum reduced the need for physical struggle and minimized sound. In tactical terms, the device was not a hazard but a way of shaping the battlefield in a place where there was no room for error. Technically, the design was primitive but deliberate. A small fighting knife, standard issue in his kit, had been fixed against his boot with a reinforced leather sheath cut open at the leading edge to expose only the tip and first few centimeters of the blade. The angle mattered. Too steep and the blade would deflect. Too shallow and it would slice without depth. He spent nights adjusting it with scraps of cloth and wire, testing the balance against the motion of his stride. The cord was a darkened, waxed length of parachute line, chosen because it resisted moisture and maintained tension in the cold. He tied it low, barely 6 inches above the ground, anchoring one end to a root hidden beneath the frost and looping the other around his boot. When tension came on the line, it pulled the guard directly into the blade's arc. It was not a trap set for hours. It was a timed mechanism controlled by his position and his footwork. The knife was not left behind. The device was an extension of the wearer, removed the moment it had done its work. A crude tool, yes, but mechanically reliable, controllable, and silent. Those qualities, however, were exactly why command distrusted such inventions. Leadership in London had seen how improvised weapons could spiral into uncontrolled practices. The rules banning tripline devices were not bureaucratic stubbornness. They were born from earlier incidents in occupied Europe, where crude traps placed on roads had harmed civilians or been discovered by German patrols, provoking harsh reprisals. Command believed that each operative carried not just a mission, but the responsibility to avoid unnecessary suffering among local populations. They feared that any device relying on chance, even a controlled tripline, could create more problems than it solved. Moreover, they needed operatives to follow predictable methods. Predictability made training coherent. Improvisation made results uncertain. And uncertain results created risk in a network where a single compromised agent could unravel entire resistance circuits. His decision to ignore the rule placed him not just outside doctrine, but outside the trust that bound clandestine operations together. Yet to the German guards who walked those narrow tracks, none of this mattered. Their world was shaped by fatigue, cold, and routine. Many were older reservists or younger conscripts assigned to occupation duty. They carried rifles with stiff bolts in winter and wore heavy coats that restricted movement. They were trained to watch for shapes, not subtleties. Their patrol routes rarely changed, and in the gloom of pre-dawn, their focus drifted toward distant tree lines or the faint glimmer of farmhouse windows rather than the darkened ground beneath their feet. Their vulnerability was not incompetence, it was the human tendency toward pattern and comfort. The war's front lines were miles away. Danger felt theoretical. In that mindset, a silent threat mere inches above the soil became invisible. Their confidence in predictable routines contained the quiet flaw that the operative had spent days studying. And in that flaw lay the path to the confrontation that would unfold with lethal precision. All these angles, human, tactical, technical, hierarchical, and enemy, interlocked in the moments before the decisive encounter, converging into the narrow track where frost, darkness, and motion would decide the outcome in less than 2 minutes. The moment began at Yo 4A. 12. A thin crescent of moon hung low over the fields, barely strong enough to outline the tops of the stone walls that framed the narrow French track. Frost crackled faintly beneath the boots of the first German sentry pair as they emerged from the bend. 2 silhouettes moving in steady rhythm, rifles slung, shoulders hunched against the cold. Their lantern, carried low, cast a trembling pool of amber light only a meter ahead of them. Beyond that light, the darkness thickened into a single unbroken shape. He lay within that shape, half concealed against the collapsed side of the cattle shed. His fingers rested lightly on the length of waxed cord stretched across the track. The tension was precise, tight enough to hold form, loose enough to give him control. When the guards reached the midpoint, he exhaled once, shallow and slow, then shifted his left foot a few centimeters forward. The cord lifted almost imperceptibly. The first guard stepped into it. The trip was silent. One heartbeat he was upright. The next he pitched forward, momentum carrying him directly toward the angled blade fixed against the operative's boot. The steel met him at the base of the throat. His weight drove the knife in cleanly, and he collapsed without a sound, his rifle slipping from his hand and settling on the frost with a muted thud. The second guard reacted too late. His lantern swung wildly as he reached for his rifle, but the light betrayed him. In the split second of confusion, the operative swept the cord sideways, tightening it and pulling it across the man's legs. The guard stumbled, falling to his knees. Before he could shout, a gloved hand closed over his mouth, pulling him backward into the shadows. A brief struggle, a sharp compression of the carotid, and the second man went limp. 30 seconds had passed. At Zo 4:13, the next rotation approached, the second pair walking faster, aware only that their relief should have been visible ahead. Their footsteps echoed between the stone buildings, crisp and unfaltering. The operative dragged the bodies into the hollow beside him. Resetting the cord in one motion, his breath remained steady. His boot knife, still hidden, gleamed faintly in the moonlight. The third guard in line spotted the lantern rolling on its side, and for the first time suspicion cut through the routine. He stepped closer, leaning down to grasp it, then his knee brushed the cord. The line snapped upward. His balance broke. His chin struck the frozen earth as he fell. The operative pivoted his leg, guiding the angle precisely. The blade struck just below the ear. A muted gasp escaped, then nothing. The fourth man swung his rifle up, voice rising, but the narrowness of the track hindered him. The stone wall at his left prevented a full stance. The body of his falling comrade blocked his right. He tried to chamber around. The cold jammed the bolt halfway. In that vulnerable pause, the operative surged forward, catching the rifle, pushing it aside, and driving the guard backward into the wall. The impact stunned him. A rapid downward strike with the hilt of the knife followed. The man slumped, unconscious. It was now 04:18. 6 guards had been neutralized. The final pair, stationed farther down the track, called out after hearing the muffled impact. Their footsteps quickened, but when they turned the corner, the operative had already withdrawn behind the structure, the bodies concealed in the shadows, the lantern extinguished. The track appeared empty, silent, and unchanged. Convinced it was only an animal or a loose crate, the last pair returned to their post. In less than 90 seconds, the route to the cable junction lay open, quiet, intact, and unexplained. But what followed in the hours and days after the silent confrontation would determine the true impact of that forbidden device. Dawn broke slowly over the farmland, its pale light stretching across the frost-hardened fields and revealing a landscape that, at first glance, looked undisturbed. The narrow track where 6 men had fallen remained quiet. No alarm sounded. No patrol swept through in search of an intruder. For nearly 2 hours after the incident, the German positions along the nearby cable junction maintained their ordinary rhythm, changing guard, boiling water for coffee, checking field lines for interference. The absence of gunfire or shouting allowed them to assume nothing unusual had taken place. The operative used that window carefully. He crossed the track, moved between the low stone buildings, and reached the small depression behind the farmstead where the underground cables rose briefly to enter a junction box set beside a telegraph pole. His orders were limited: assess the lines, take a rubbing of the identification plates, and confirm the routing used by German observers along the coast. It was intelligence work, not sabotage. London needed information, not disruption. The coming Allied invasion would rely on understanding how German reporting networks passed sightings from coastal batteries to regional command. Within minutes, he had the rubbings secured in an oilskin pouch. He followed the hedgerow northward, taking a route he had memorized from the resistance courier who briefed him 2 nights earlier. By mid-morning, he was hidden in a loft above a barn used by local farmers, waiting for the safe house contact who would transfer him to the next relay point. The mission objectives had been met, yet even as he began the long return toward the coast, the consequences of the night's violence were taking shape behind him. When the next relief guard team arrived on the track shortly before Hundrey Odi, they noticed the first anomaly: footprints scattered across the frost where no patrol should have doubled back. Then they saw the overturned lantern. The bodies, concealed in the shadowed recess behind the collapsed shed, were found only after one of the guards followed a trail of smudged frost leading off the path. The discovery triggered an immediate alarm. Officers from the nearest Feldgendarmerie detachment arrived within the hour, sealing off the track and conducting a wider sweep across the farmland. The scene puzzled them: 6 men killed with almost no noise, no spent cartridges, no visible bullet wounds. 2 showed signs of strangulation, others bore single, precise cuts delivered at the same angle. The cord, recovered later from the frost, gave investigators little clarity, only evidence that something had been stretched low across the path. The lack of answers unsettled the command staff more than open sabotage would have. A threat that made no sound implied an enemy capable of moving through their lines at will. Reports circulated through German administrative channels, noting the silent elimination of multiple sentries by unknown assailant. Some officers suspected partisans. Others blamed Allied commandos. A few argued the attack indicated internal disorder or infiltration among local labourers. None of the hypotheses matched the evidence cleanly. By evening, additional patrols had been deployed, checkpoints reinforced, and the cable junction area placed under temporary lockdown. The guards who remained on duty felt the weight of the incident. Caution replaced complacency. Even those who had not known the fallen men now walked with lanterns raised higher and rifles held tighter. For the operative, the aftermath was more personal. When he reached his extraction point days later, the debriefing officer recorded the mission as successful but noted the violation of standing equipment regulations. The Tripline knife, though effective, had been explicitly banned. Discipline demanded a formal reprimand. Yet the reality of clandestine war was more complicated. His actions had prevented detection, preserved a vital intelligence route, and avoided the gunfire that would have drawn reprisals toward the nearby farms. The reprimand was entered into the file, but the same report quietly commended the adaptation of available tools under extreme conditions. In the field, results mattered, but questions lingered. What did this act say about the changing nature of clandestine warfare, and what did such tools mean for the men who used them? Those questions form the quiet undercurrent that leads into the final reflection. The silent track in northern France was not recorded in official communiques, and no monument marks the place where 6 men fell without firing a shot. It exists only in fragments, brief notes in an intelligence report, a reprimand typed in careful language, and the fading memories of those who served in the shadows of the war. Yet small moments like this, quiet and unseen, often reveal more about the conflict than the sweeping battles that dominate history books. At its core, the episode speaks to a simple truth: war forces adaptation. Not in grand declarations, but in the private decisions made by individuals who must act in narrow corridors of time and uncertainty. The operative's forbidden tool did not challenge armies or shift front lines. It altered a single night on a single path, for the sake of intelligence that would shape larger operations still months away. But in that small act lay the essence of clandestine work: innovation born from necessity, calculated risks taken because the alternative was failure. Improvised tools, especially those crafted for silent killing, sit uneasily within discussions of military history. They raise questions about morality, proportionality, and the psychological burden placed on those who wield them. The Tripline knife was banned not only for practical reasons, but because it occupied a moral grey zone, blurring the line between ingenuity and ruthlessness. Yet the war's demands often blurred those lines long before any operative did. Survival, protection of civilians, and the success of broader operations all weighed heavily on decisions made in darkness. For the German guards, the episode became a brief anomaly, an unsettling reminder that danger could emerge from silence just as easily as from open battle. They were not villains in this story, but soldiers navigating the same war with their own fears, assumptions, and routines. Their vulnerability echoed the conflict's broader truth: the front lines were fluid, and no position was truly secure. The war's reach extended into the smallest spaces, transforming ordinary farm tracks into sites of life or death calculation. Looking back, the device itself seems almost insignificant: a knife, a cord, a measured angle. Yet its impact was shaped not by its materials, but by the discipline, restraint, and focus of the man who used it. His action reflected the hidden nature of intelligence work, where victories are measured in minutes of silence, in paths opened rather than bridges destroyed, in information carried across borders rather than headlines captured. When historians study the war, they often focus on strategy and scale, but the conflict was equally defined by individuals who made choices under pressure, adapting the world around them in ways that rarely leave visible traces. The story of the Tripline knife endures not because of its brutality, but because it illustrates how a single, improvised solution can change the course of a mission, protect lives, and quietly influence the machinery of larger operations. And as dawn rises over that long-forgotten track, one truth remains: history is often shaped not by the loudest moments, but by the quiet ones that pass unnoticed, except by those who carried their weight in silence.